My family cut me off and said, "You'll never be anything." 3 years later, they invited me to the reunion if you can afford it. I arrived late, and the host announced, "Please welcome the new owner of this resort," as every face turned toward me. I, 32M, was disowned by my family 3 years ago. They just invited me to their reunion at a resort, not knowing I own it. I still remember the last family dinner before everything fell apart. My father sat at the head of the table like he always did, cutting into his steak with surgical precision while my older brother talked about his promotion at the law firm. My mother nodded along, asking all the right questions, her face glowing with pride. My sister chimed in about her husband's new medical practice. The conversation flowed around me like I wasn't even there. When there was finally a lull, I mentioned that I'd quit my job at the accounting firm. The silence that followed was deafening. My father set down his knife and fork with a deliberate clink against the china. He asked what I meant, his voice already tight with disapproval. I explained that I was starting my own business, that I'd been planning it for months, that I had investors interested in my tech platform idea. My brother laughed first. He said I was throwing away a stable career for some fantasy, that I didn't have the backbone for entrepreneurship. My sister asked if I'd lost my mind. My mother just looked at me with disappointment, the kind that cuts deeper than anger. But it was my father's response that sealed everything. He told me I was a fool, that I'd always been the weak link in the family, that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Then he said something I'll never forget, that I'd never be anything, that I'd come crawling back within 6 months, and when I did, I shouldn't expect their help. I left that dinner and didn't look back. The first year was brutal. My savings evaporated faster than I'd anticipated. The tech platform I'd built had potential, but gaining traction was harder than any business book had prepared me for. I lived in a studio apartment that barely fit a bed, ate ramen more nights than I care to remember, and worked 18-hour days. My brother sent me one text during that time, saying he'd heard I was struggling and that I should admit I'd failed before I embarrassed the family further. I didn't respond. My phone stayed silent otherwise. No calls on my birthday. Nothing on holidays. I reached out to my mother once, about 8 months in, just to let her know I was okay. She was polite but cold, said my father didn't want to hear from me until I'd given up my foolish venture and returned to proper employment. I asked if that was how she felt too. She didn't answer directly, just said she had to go and hung up. The second year brought a breakthrough. A major company took interest in my platform, and after months of negotiations, they acquired it. The payout was substantial, more money than I'd ever imagined having. But I didn't stop there. I used that capital to invest in other startups, consulted for tech companies, and started identifying undervalued properties. I'd always been good with numbers, and I'd learned that real wealth wasn't built on one success, but on smart, strategic moves that compounded over time. By year 3, I'd built something real. My portfolio included investments in 6 different companies, 2 of which had gone public. But the crown jewel was a struggling resort property I'd acquired 18 months earlier. The place had history and potential, but had been mismanaged into near bankruptcy. I bought it for a fraction of what it was worth, brought in the right people, redesigned the business model, and turned it into one of the most sought-after venues in the region. The transformation took every bit of knowledge I'd accumulated and some luck, but it worked. The invitation came via email on a Tuesday afternoon. It was from my sister, sent to what must have been an old email address she had stored somewhere. The message was brief and had that particular tone that managed to be both impersonal and condescending. She wrote that the family was planning a reunion, that it would be at Clearwater Resort, and that I was welcome to attend if I could afford the accommodations. She included the dates and room rates, which I found amusing since I'd set those rates myself 6 months ago. At the bottom, she added that it would be good for me to see how well everyone was doing, that perhaps it would motivate me to finally get my life together. I sat with that email for a long time. My first instinct was to ignore it, to let them have their reunion without me. But something else stirred underneath that instinct. Not quite anger, not quite vindication, but something in between. I thought about my father's words, about being nothing, about being the weak link. I thought about 3 years of silence, of being erased from family photos and conversations, of holidays spent alone while they presumably gathered and congratulated each other on their successes. I replied to my sister that I would attend. I kept my response as brief as hers had been, just confirming that I'd be there and thanking her for the invitation. I didn't mention anything about the resort, didn't hint at my circumstances. I just said I'd see them there. The weeks leading up to the reunion, I coordinated with my resort manager. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who'd helped turn the place around, and when I explained the situation, she understood immediately. We went over every detail. The reunion was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, with check-ins beginning Friday evening. I would arrive late to the Saturday gathering, after everyone had settled in and the official program had started. I drove up on Saturday morning, parking in the owner's reserved spot behind the main building where guests wouldn't see. The resort looked magnificent. The grounds had been completely renovated, with native landscaping that rolled down to the waterfront. The main lodge had been restored to highlight its original architecture while incorporating modern luxury. Guest reviews had been outstanding, and we were booked solid through the next 8 months. My manager met me in the back office and gave me a rundown. She told me my family had checked in the previous evening, that my father had complained about the room rates but paid anyway, that my brother had made a point of telling the front desk staff about his partnership at his law firm, as if that would get him an upgrade. She said they'd gathered for breakfast that morning in the main dining room, and that my sister had apparently told several other guests that her family practically had a private event here, exaggerating their importance in that way people do when they're trying to impress strangers. I spent the morning in my office, reviewing some contracts and returning emails, but I couldn't focus. The knot in my stomach tightened as the afternoon approached. I changed into a suit, something well-tailored but not flashy, and stood in front of the mirror in my private quarters. The man looking back at me was different from the one who'd walked out of that family dinner 3 years ago. Older, definitely. More tired around the eyes, but also more solid, more certain. The reunion was being held in our largest event space, a room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. I could hear voices and laughter as I approached through the staff corridor. My manager walked beside me, reviewing the plan one more time. She would go in first, welcome everyone as the resort manager, thank them for choosing Clearwater for their family event, and then introduce me as the owner who wanted to personally greet such a significant gathering. She entered right on schedule. I waited in the hallway, listening to her voice carry through the door as she welcomed everyone and spoke about the resort's history and recent transformation. I could pick out my father's voice in the murmur, making some comment I couldn't quite hear. Someone laughed. Then my manager was saying that the resort's owner wanted to personally welcome such a distinguished family group, that he made a point of connecting with guests who appreciated what they'd built here. I walked through the door, and every face in the room turned toward me. The silence was absolute. I watched the recognition hit them in waves. My sister's smile froze in place, her wine glass halfway to her lips. My brother's expression went from polite interest to shock to something harder to define. My mother's hand went to her throat. But it was my father's face that I couldn't look away from, the color draining, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing as he processed what he was seeing. My manager completed the introduction, saying my name and title, welcoming them to my resort. Then she quietly exited, leaving me alone with 37 relatives who I hadn't spoken to in 3 years. I thanked them for coming, keeping my voice level and professional. I said that Clearwater was honored to host their reunion, that I hoped they were enjoying the facilities and would let staff know if they needed anything. I didn't mention our history. I didn't acknowledge the silence or the shock. I simply spoke to them as I would to any guests. My father found his voice first. He said my name like a question, like he still wasn't sure I was real. He asked what kind of game I was playing. I replied that I wasn't playing anything, that I owned the resort, that I'd purchased and renovated it over the past 18 months, and that I was simply welcoming them as I would any group that had booked our facilities. My brother said that wasn't possible, that I'd been struggling, that I'd thrown my life away. I asked him what made him think that. He didn't have an answer, just stammered something about assumptions and last they'd heard. I mentioned that the last they'd heard was 3 years ago, and that perhaps they shouldn't have assumed anything about a person they'd cut off completely. My sister set down her wine glass and said I should have told them. The anger in her voice was barely concealed. She said I'd let them send that invitation without saying anything, that I'd embarrassed them. I reminded her that she'd invited me if I could afford it, that she'd suggested I needed to see how well everyone was doing to motivate me to get my life together. I asked her how exactly I should have responded to that. My mother started to cry, which was something I hadn't anticipated. She said she hadn't known, that none of them had known, that I'd never told them. I felt something twist in my chest, but kept my voice steady. I told her that I'd tried to reach out once, early on, and had been told not to contact them again until I'd given up my business and returned to proper employment. I asked her what exactly I was supposed to share when that was the condition for communication. An uncle I barely remembered spoke up from the back, saying this was supposed to be a family event, that we shouldn't air grievances. I agreed with him, said I had no interest in airing anything, that I simply wanted to welcome them and ensure their stay was comfortable. My father made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. He said I'd clearly orchestrated this, that I'd waited until they'd all gathered just to humiliate them. I looked at him directly for the first time. I told him that I'd received an invitation to a family event and had accepted it. I said that if anyone should feel humiliated, it should probably be me, the family member they disowned and told would never be anything, who then received an invitation dripping with condescension about whether I could afford to attend. I mentioned that I could have simply declined, could have revealed who I was beforehand, or could have banned them from the resort entirely since it was my property. But I'd chosen to let them come, to welcome them properly, because despite everything, they were still family. The room was silent again. A cousin in her 20s who I'd once been close with asked if I was okay, if the last 3 years had been okay. The genuine concern in her voice nearly broke something in me. I told her honestly that it had been hard, that the first year especially had been brutal, but that I'd built something I was proud of. I said I'd learned who I was without the family's expectations or judgments, and that while I wouldn't want to repeat those years, I also wouldn't trade what I'd learned. My brother said he wanted to apologize, but the words came out stiff and rehearsed. I told him I wasn't sure I was ready for apologies, that I needed time to process all of this. My sister argued that I was being unfair, that I couldn't blame them for believing I'd failed when I'd cut off contact. I reminded her, with some heat in my voice now, that I hadn't cut off contact. They had. I said that I'd been erased from this family completely, that my reaching out had been rejected, and that they didn't get to rewrite that history now that circumstances had changed. My father stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He said we should speak privately, that this wasn't the place. I told him that I'd said everything I needed to say, that they were welcome to enjoy the reunion and the resort, and that my staff would ensure their stay was excellent. I mentioned that their rooms and meals had already been comped as a courtesy, that they wouldn't be charged anything beyond what they'd already paid for the event space. Then I turned to leave. My mother called after me, asking me to wait. I stopped at the door, but didn't turn around. She said she'd made a mistake, that she should have fought my father's decision to cut me off, that she'd thought about me every day for 3 years. She asked if I could forgive her. I stood there for a long moment. Part of me wanted to turn around, to accept whatever reconciliation was being offered, to fold back into the family that had shaped my entire life until 3 years ago. But another part of me, the part that had survived those brutal early months, that had built something from nothing, that had learned to exist without their approval, knew it wasn't that simple. I told her, without turning around, that I didn't know. I said that forgiveness wasn't something I could just produce on demand, that 3 years of silence and rejection had changed me in ways I was still figuring out. I mentioned that the door was open now if they wanted to reach out, really reach out, but that I wouldn't pretend the last 3 years hadn't happened just to make everyone comfortable. Then I walked out. I spent the rest of the afternoon in my office, unable to focus on anything. My manager checked in once, asked if I was okay. I told her I didn't know how to answer that question. She said that what I'd done took courage, and whether or not I felt good about it now, I should remember that I'd handled it with more grace than many people would have managed. That evening, there was a knock on my private quarters door. I opened it to find my cousin, the one who'd asked if I was okay. She said she hoped it was all right that she'd asked staff where to find me, that she wanted to talk if I was willing. I let her in. She told me that after I'd left, the reunion had fallen apart. Some relatives were angry at my parents and siblings for how they'd treated me. Others were defensive, saying I'd ambushed everyone. A few had checked out early, uncomfortable with the whole situation. She said the family was fractured in a way she'd never seen before, and while part of her felt guilty about that, another part thought it was long overdue. I asked her why she hadn't reached out during the 3 years. She was honest, said she'd thought about it but hadn't wanted to go against my parents' wishes, that she'd assumed I was probably fine and would reconnect when I was ready. She apologized for that assumption, for taking the easy path instead of checking on me herself. I appreciated the honesty more than I could express. We talked for over an hour. She told me about family events I'd missed, about how my absence was always this unspoken thing hanging over gatherings, how my father refused to let anyone mention me, but my mother would get this look whenever something reminded her of me. She said my brother had made several comments over the years about how I'd probably given up and was working some dead-end job, too embarrassed to admit I'd been wrong. My sister, apparently, had told people I'd moved abroad and was finding myself, which was her way of saving face about the estrangement. Before she left, my cousin asked if I thought I'd ever really be part of the family again. I told her truthfully that I didn't know what that would even look like anymore. The family I'd left 3 years ago didn't exist, and the person I'd been then didn't exist either. Maybe something new could be built, but it would have to be on different terms, with honesty instead of hierarchy, with respect instead of expectations. The next morning was checkout day. I stayed in my office, reviewing reports and avoiding the main areas of the resort. My manager called up around 10 to say my parents were at the front desk asking if they could speak with me. I went down despite every instinct telling me not to. They were standing in the lobby looking older than I remembered. My father's shoulders weren't as square, my mother's face more lined. They asked if we could sit somewhere private, and I led them to a small meeting room off the main hall. My father spoke first. He said that he'd been wrong, that his pride had gotten in the way of seeing what I was actually capable of, that he'd judged me too harshly. He said he'd spent 3 years assuming I'd failed because he couldn't imagine any other outcome, and that seeing the resort, seeing what I'd built, had forced him to confront his own prejudices. He told me he was proud of me, and I could hear that the words cost him something to say. My mother reached for my hand across the table. She said that cutting me off had been the worst decision of her life, that she'd gone along with my father because she always had, but that she should have fought for me. She asked if I could give them another chance, if they could be part of my life again. I pulled my hand back, not cruelly but firmly. I told them I appreciated them coming to say this, that I knew it wasn't easy for them. But I also said that 3 years of being told I was nothing, of being erased from the family, couldn't be fixed with one conversation. I explained that I'd built a life without them, had learned to make decisions without seeking their approval, had become someone they didn't actually know anymore. My father asked what I wanted from them. I said I didn't know, that maybe I'd figure it out with time, but that right now I needed space. I told them they could have my email and phone number, that I wouldn't block contact, but that I also wouldn't jump back into playing happy family like nothing had happened. I mentioned that if they wanted to rebuild something, it would have to be gradual and real, not just motivated by guilt or shock at my success. They left shortly after, both looking diminished in a way that gave me no satisfaction. I watched their car pull away from the resort entrance and felt nothing but exhausted. Update. It's been 3 months since the reunion. The resort continues to thrive, and I've expanded my investment portfolio to include 2 more properties. Work keeps me busy, which I'm grateful for. My mother has emailed every week since that day, sending updates about mundane things, the weather, books she's reading, shows she's watching. She never asks for responses, never pushes for more than I'm willing to give. I've replied twice, brief messages acknowledging her emails. It's something, I guess. My father sent one email, about a month after the reunion. He wrote about his own father, my grandfather, who'd apparently been equally harsh and unbending. He said he'd spent his whole life trying to prove something to a man who never gave approval, and he'd done the same thing to his own children without realizing it. He didn't ask for forgiveness, just said he understood if I never wanted a relationship with him again. I haven't responded yet, but I haven't deleted it either. My brother showed up at the resort 2 weeks ago, without warning. I almost had security remove him, but something made me agree to meet him in the lobby. He said he'd been in therapy, working through why he'd been so threatened by my choices, why he'd mocked me instead of supported me. He admitted that watching me take a risk he'd been too afraid to take had made him feel small, and he'd lashed out because of it. He asked if we could get coffee sometime. No expectations, just 2 people talking. I told him maybe, eventually, but not yet. My sister hasn't reached out at all, which somehow bothers me more than if she'd sent angry messages. My cousin has stayed in touch regularly, and we've met for lunch a few times. She's become an unexpected bridge to the family, sharing information both ways without pressure or judgment. I'm not sure where any of this will end up. Some days I think about reaching out more, trying to build something with the family again. Other days I remember those 3 years of silence and think maybe what I have now, distance, independence, peace, is enough. What I know for sure is that I'm not the person who walked out of that family dinner 3 years ago. I built myself from nothing, proved that I could survive without their approval or support, created something substantial and meaningful with my own hands and mind. They can be part of my life going forward or not, but either way, I know exactly who I am now. And I know I was never nothing. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us.